our hall. Our session here is the Art Critic, and we have Pablo Bartholomew in conversation with Ashok Vajpeyi and Rosalyn de Mello. Thank you so much. I request everyone to make sure that your cell phones are switched off and no flash photography while the sessions are on. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's really nice to see so many of you over here. Today we're going to discuss a book that has been many, many years in the making, and it's called The Art Critic. And unfortunately, the author of this book is no more. He died in 1985. He was born in 1926. And his name was Richard Bartholomew. He was Pablo's father over here. So my name is Rosalyn. I'm the editor of Art Info India, which is an online art daily. And I'm going to be talking to Mr. Ashok Vajpeyi. Mr. Ashok Vajpeyi is a Hindi poet, critic, translator, editor, and a culture activist. He's basically a very important cultural figure in Delhi. And he is also at present the executive trustee of the Raza Foundation, which is based in New Delhi. And on my left, we have Pablo Bartholomew, who is we just found out is going to be awarded a Padma Shri. And he is an award-winning photojournalist, won the World Press Award in 1975 when he was when he was about 19 years old, and then again in 1984 for the Bhopal gas tragedy photographs that he did, that one photograph. So we're going to start with Mr. Ashok Vajpeyi just introducing the book, the subject a little bit, and we're going to show you a little video that we had made especially for this occasion. Mr. Vajpeyi?
In 1960, I came to Delhi to study MA in English literature at St. Stephen's. And I had come from a small town, and I didn't know much about art, and I decided to make myself culturally literate. And so I started visiting exhibitions, attending classical music recitals, dance recitals, theater performances, etc. And it was about that time that Richard Bartholomew was writing art criticism. In Delhi, there were others who were writing, the statesmen, Charles Fabry and Kishore Malik and all that. But it was Richard Bartholomew who caught our attention. He was a poet, basically. He was of Burmese origin, and he had come to Delhi, and he would write in this journal, which nobody now remembers, but it was a very important weekly called Thought. And it was there that he brought his poetic sensibility to bear upon the contemporaneous artistic activity. And I was just remembering this afternoon that at the same time in Bombay, which was another important center for modern Indian art, there was another poet writing, Nassim Ezekiel, who wrote in English. And both of them, in a sense, were harping back to a very well-entrenched French tradition of art criticism. Some of you who would be knowledgeable about art criticism would perhaps recall that the modern art criticism in French was actually founded by a great poet, Charles Baudelaire. And after that, there has been a tradition. I mean, Baudelaire, Apollinaire, Mallarmé, Paul Éluard, Frank-André Jammes, Yves Bonnefoy. So you have a series of, so there was some relationship, at least in that part of the world where some of the most outstanding modern art took place in the world, in France, between poetry and visual arts. And here was this man, a Burmese, coming to India and founding, in a manner of speaking, modern art criticism. We'll come to it later, tell you. And this book, The Art Critic, about which I'm sure Pablo will tell you how it had been in coming for many years and how it came about, is a kind of a tome which falls on your head, it will likely to break your head, I mean. But this is a compendium of what he did. And if you were to know what was happening in Indian art in 60s, 70s, and 80s, there could be no other book than this one. And it is suitably called the Art Critic. And we'll perhaps show a video.
This was a video that Pablo put together a few months ago when we launched the book in Delhi. And what Pablo did was he spoke to a number of artists who are based in Delhi who Richard knew very intimately, who wrote about, he wrote about their work, he critiqued their work. And this film, it's a very short film. It'll give you a really lovely sense of the relationship that he had with artists and how prominent he was on the art scene.
You'll have to forgive me for the bad technical quality. I'm really a photographer, not a filmmaker, but let's look at the video. Can we have the video, please?
You have to raise your hand or something, I don't know. To whom? The gods that be. The angels that are. The devils who should be. Oh, there you are.
In 1950, I decided to go to France. Switzerland and England. No, England didn't interest me. I was only interested in France and I went out every year. Some artists who went to America and elsewhere. And I had really got a scholarship from the French government to study at the National in Paris. And I liked France so much that I said no and decided to continue my research there as well as possible. And that lasted 60 years.
I had just returned back from Paris after 3 years education. And Richard was just on the verge of getting married. So he was inviting some people who were stealing the copy of his friends for marriage. But as he didn't know me, so he became Richard. And when I inquired from some common friends, then they told me that Mr. Bartholomew, who is teaching me in school. And then gradually, more than
You were coming back to me. The story of your birth. When I came back from Mexico, I had my first television. I had heard
I opened, it was Richard and Leslie standing outside. I never met them before, and they came to invite us for dinner because they were living only few blocks in Jammu. So that is how we actually, I was quite taken aback that a person of this status, for me as a young artist, that he should come and invite me for dinner, which is not what I heard about Delhi and the art critics.
Everybody was coming to me sometimes. Like once somebody had come through saying and Karthik was there, and all the artists there came, and that one day then Chipti from Bombay.
You name it. I mean, the place was just jammed packed full of graduate painters. What was the building? The one, it was a golden moon in the
Delhi, sometimes in exhibition, at that time, we just came around with the telephone.
Tayyab was in our house almost every single day, every day. And there was very little help and assistance which was offered in those days, which I'm sorry to say, I didn't see much of that happening these days. Now what's happening there? Santosh, I mean, people with flashing ideologies and nobody cares. It was quite a wonderful, wonderful experience.
They were all looking each other's work, discussing it with a great enthusiasm.
So we had a, first time ever, there were three important people who were involved in our writing.
In fact, when I came to Delhi, the most distinguished art critics were Charles Fabry and Richard. Because whatever they wrote, it mattered quite a lot to the artist.
Actually, he was a painter. He was an artist. He was a photographer. He was a visual man. And he was, and more than that, very few people realized he was a very good writer.
Well, what I heard is that, I have heard about Charles Fabry is very tough, and he doesn't like money artist. And Richard is much more tougher, and it is very difficult to get a good review from him. And perhaps that made Richard a little unique in the art criticism, because Richard never made any compromise as far as his views about artists are concerned.
What is gradually motives are that is the base of criticism told by its writing power, not just as subject you are doing.
So he had the facility for words and accurate words, which is very important. Because it's nice to say this is lovely, that's not art. He was able to think about it and know exactly the direction of what the fadings and everything else. The other wonderful thing about Richard was that there were no recriminations. If he said something, it was said in a spirit which was to do with the work itself, not with the painter. You know what I mean? He wasn't running down people or pushing people out. He was very friendly with people.
And he wrote a bad review about my work. But anyway, I didn't take it seriously. But that night when we were taking dinner, Chameli was not smiling. And Richard noticed that she is very grim. So Richard said, the art criticism in India affects not the artists only, their wives. So that is remark about his own review. Actually, Richard's writing is interesting because he has also a lot of sense of humor. When he criticized with a lot of punch. Not, when you read, you enjoy reading it. Even when he enjoy reading it because it's like it. So, the last time when I met, actually, he said he's going to Japan. And when he came back, I met him only once. And he said, I have got some gift for you from Japan. And I will give you next time when you meet. But then next time when I met, he was in the hospital, completely paralyzed.
I think today Indian contemporary artists taken up very seriously, not only in the country but all over the world. And I hope we can go further.
Thanks. So Pablo, maybe you could start by just telling us something about, this book as a project and why it took so many years.
Show the book, I think,
Yeah.
first.
Here it is.
The cover, as you'll see, it's actually a page from Macbeth. It was Richard's copy of Macbeth, and it has all these really cryptic circles around random words, and then it points out to a number, and nobody has been able to understand exactly what that code is. But that's the cover.
Well, it took us a long time, like any family that's left with a residue of work. You really quite don't know what to do with it. And he died in '85. It was a time publishing itself was, I think, in a fairly nascent stage. And we thought about trying to bring the book out. The first part, my mother with another friend of hers, Carmen Cargill, and me building the archives. And when I say building the archives, it was going to the various libraries to find work that he had written which was missing. Put it together. Then a family friend, and all of this is at the back of the book as my afterword. I don't name people because some of it can be quite explosive and sensitive, but some very important people sort of promised to do things and it never happened. And in the process, there was an appropriation of the archive and never quite got it back when my mother tried to get it back. It came back partially, and I had to then go into a second round to rebuild this archive again. And once we finally rebuilt it, the editing process between my mother, my mother's friend, and my friend, Carmen Cargill, happened. With me always on the side, I didn't want to get involved with any of the decisions because, for one, I'm not a person of words, I'm a person of pictures, and I think my mother knew the material the best, partly because in the journal that Ashokji just mentioned, Thought, my mother also wrote on theatre. My father wrote in art, my mother wrote in theatre. And she was familiar with his life and the work that through the various stages. Once the editing process happened, this just sat around till the painter Ram Kumar said, listen, this is an important document, we've got to get it out. Again, he pointed us to a gallerist publisher who kind of thought that he would do a very small book and in the bargain get some work from Ram Kumar, and you know, that sort of didn't sit right, so that didn't go anywhere. And my mother, who was in theatre and worked as a theatre activist, would travel a lot within India, out of India to Pakistan and Bangladesh to work with women's groups doing street theatre. So for her, you know, apart from the act of putting a structure to all of this writing, she really couldn't navigate the next step as to how to bring it out or what to do. And I needed her because I was at that point of my life quite busy as a photojournalist, and India was going through all its trials and tribulations from the early 80s into the mid 90s. And I didn't have time to sort of devote you know, my energy to try and put the book. So it went on the back burner. I would ask my mother from time to time, come on, let's get this going. But, you know, she would sort of always say that I have other priorities, which was her theatre work. So it just sat. Then she had a stroke about 8 years ago. And then I said, oh shit, this is, you know, never going to happen. I let it be for a while. I thought my mother's stroke, her paralysis would improve, some things would sort of, maybe a miracle would happen. That didn't happen, and a period of 7 years went by, and I said to myself, well, in the meantime, I started to bring my archive, which I'd abandoned, of photography, which was of 30 years ago, my teenage work. Then I started to deal with my father's photographic work. And once I finished with both these, then I thought, this is the momentum that I have, the time to get on and get this going. We went around, asked the government for some money. We were given a great promise, but that promise unfortunately didn't come through. And then I sort of just said to myself that I'm going to do this, and I went ahead and self-published this huge book. So I have this wonderful risk now of trying to distribute it. One of the great sort of silver linings on the cloud was when Vajpeyi ji said to me that, well, yeah, the Raza Foundation could be interested. And so they came in and bought a certain number of copies. And for me, that's been one part of it. And then I have an online system of distributing it. And we found distributors in India through which the book goes out. So that's, in a nutshell, the making of the book. It still has to completely go through the circle of getting into your bookshelves.
Thank you, Pablo. Mr. Vajpeyi, you were talking about so much about how the Indian art criticism, the tradition, borrowed so much without even knowing it from the French art criticism sort of tradition. And maybe you could talk a bit about that and give our audience a sense of what the scene was in terms of art criticism in Delhi at that time, from, say, the 50s to about the 70s.
You know, at that time, the art critic mattered. There were very few of them, but art critics mattered because they wrote fearlessly, they wrote with a degree of fair-mindedness and objectivity, but they wrote with courage and sensitivity, and Richard surely was one of them. At that time, the number of galleries in the whole country was rather small, and therefore there was no networking of that kind. from that time to now is a big change. There are more than 400 galleries, and the artists are selling well. There is an art buying public. So there's a lot of money. And when there's a lot of money in anything, something troublesome happens. And that troublesome thing that happened in art criticism today is that there is no art criticism. What you have is critical essays done on commission as essays in the catalogue, or coffee table books, which all of them, if you take them together, India must be having about 5,000 great artists, which of course is a great lie, and is not a fact. And none of them criticizes, or none of them points out, because if you commission, you're not supposed to point out, you can't have a Richard Bartholomew kind of an art critic who will come out and write what he or she feels. The art critic may be wrong. The art critic, after all, reputations in art are not merely built by art critics, they are built by many other factors. But the art critics matter. Now what has happened is, because both the electronic and the print media have withdrawn from art criticism. Most of art criticism in India, or for that matter the world over, was promoted by media. There are pages. They're still in Europe and in America. The newspapers carry reviews. In India, they have stopped it. I don't know why, but they have. After all, Richard Bartholomew wrote in Once in Times of India and Thought and this, that, and the other. Any number of people who wrote in them. And therefore, there was a space other than the space provided by those who are interested in the art business. So there was a degree of distance from that activity, and there was a degree of objectivity and fearlessness. You could say, this is bad, this is bad. But now you can't do that, because there's just nothing. If you go to Delhi and most metro cities, art criticism does not exist in the print media. It hardly exists on the electronic media. What exists, however, are the parties, the page 3. So you have these glamorous girls. They're very nice and very desirable, perhaps, but they don't amount to promote art. They perhaps promote themselves, but that's what it is. So it's and therefore it's very important to remind the art-loving people in this country that art needs to be taken seriously and critically. 2, that there is a role that art criticism can play, developing norms of understanding, procedures or regimes of analysis and such like, and that art does not take place in a void, it takes place in a context. And sometimes the context would be clarified or illuminated by what the art critic does. Because the artist's job is to paint or to sculpt or to do whatever. It is not his job or his business or her business to explain the context or to explain the text, as it were. My job as a poet is to create the text. My job is not supposed to be that I explain to others what the deuce I am doing. That is the job of the critic. And that critic, sadly, is missing. There are art writers. They're very young people who are doing excellent work. But they are all being commissioned to do that work. And I have yet to know a commissioner who would say, you can demolish this artist and we'll still publish it. Nobody would. So that becomes a kind of a vicious circle. And I like to, Geeta Kapoor, who's one of our finest art critic, has written an introduction to this book. And she points out to an important element. She says, what Richard did was to nurture the field of contemporary art using metaphors and allegories of life, death, and beauty. And though we might quibble a little with the poetry, he did literally forge a language on the anvil, in the smithy of the soul, as Joyce would say. Now, art criticism grows with art practice. So you have to keep on struggling to find a new vocabulary, a new set of concepts which may be, the concepts which explain, let's say, art in the 80s may not be the concepts which will explain the installations today and video art and new media art. You need new concepts and you need new strategies. In fact, you need a new language. Just as the art has found a new language, you need a new language. And that cannot be forged except in the smithy of the soul. And how many of them have souls? And how many are willing to turn their souls into smithies? So that's a big question. And that, I think, is a very important element where we seem to be lacking. And the book is a reminder, among anything. Richard was a friend of many artists. He visited their studios. It was not sitting and watching. Now, of course, you need not go to the studios because you get everything on this goddamn, whatever it is called, and you can. But that was a time when a conversation and a dialogue with the artist, trying to understand what they are trying to do and pick up from there, and yet retain your sense of judgment, your sense of sanity, your sense of objectivity and fair play. Now, that kind of a collaboration, art movements are not entirely creations of artists. They very much need art critics who are going to explain, provide the mystique, analyze the mystique of what artists are trying to do. I have talked too much, so I must shut up. Yeah.
Actually, I was wondering if, Pablo, if you could perhaps intervene. There are two things that Mr. Vajpeyi said that it would be interesting to get your inputs. One is about the urgency of the print media. You know, how there was a time when critics would see something and then come back home and write it, and it would be, printed the next day in the newspaper. So maybe if you could tell us a bit about that. You must have watched your father, as he was doing his job as a critic for newspapers, for Times of India, Telegraph, Statesman.
Well, as a young kid, often I would be taken with him to the galleries. He would walk around, sometimes come much before the show opened, and just, come in incognito, piece of paper in hand, pen, walk around, make some notes, and then go home and write. And, he would sort of sit and have a drink. And in those days, there were the wonderful typewriters. So, you had to be fairly accurate in the way you wrote. One draft, some corrections, a second draft, and there it was. The piece was there. These were, of course, for the dailies, meaning, they were short pieces. They were not long pieces. So, and as I grew older, it was also a source of my getting pocket money, where once he wrote these pieces, I would be given 4 annas and a bus fare to go to the Times of India at night before the deadline would come to go and deliver it, and I would go and deliver it to Urvashi Bhutalia's father, who was the chief sub-editor, and they used to live right very close to us. Sometimes, if it was not going to be run the next day, I would just run to his house in the same colony in Delhi and plonk it there. But often, they were the whole thing was that if there was a show, the copy must be there. And that was a great thing, which doesn't happen anymore now, where, you know, you open a show, there's a preview, and the next morning there is a critical piece of writing on the show.
Another thing that Mr. Vajpeyi talked about was about how Richard was also friends with a lot of these artists and he visited their studios and things like that. Your father has taken some of the most wonderful photographs of a lot of Indian artists. And a lot of them used to be at your home. Can you tell us a bit about what it was like growing up in that environment where you had all these?
Today, you know, you can only hear about the auction prices. Tayyab Mehta sold for da-da-da. Souza sold more than Tayyab Mehta. Then Hussein is now selling more than both of them. It's that sort of, but you know, there was a time when most of us were quite broke. I mean, to sell a canvas for 1,600 rupees was a struggle. And, you know, my father's or my family home was the kind of hub where, because my father was a great cook, and there was always a bottle open, we would have swarms of people over every evening, drinking, fighting, talking, throwing up. So I've seen some great names do some strange things, include sort of over-flirt with somebody else's wife, things like that. But on the photography end, my father used his skills as a photographer for the catalogs, where he would write, or the brochures. For example, if he was curating an exhibition to go to England for the Festival of India, he would put all the text, the photographs together. And for that, he would do the artist portraits, the pictures of the canvases, and I would sort of help him often holding those canvases up. So I guess I've held many canvases that now cost God knows how many millions of rupees, dollars, or whatever.
Thanks, Pablo. Mr. Vajpeyi, would you like to comment a bit about this whole relationship between Richard and, you know, the relationship between the critic and the artist? Richard always maintained...
You see, the relationship between the artist and critic is quite a delicate matter. It can become, I mean, it is very sensitive. Most artists are very sensitive to criticism, and most critics are very confident of their judgmental qualities. So there is always a bit of a tension. The other tension comes that while painting is a language of its own, you use colors and this, that, and the other, the art critic uses words. So there is, how do you put something which has been done in the painterly language into the verbal language? How do you explain? So there's that kind of a tension. But if there is a healthy relationship, that is where people are willing to listen to what the art critic says, and where art critic is willing to understand what the artist is trying to do. I mean, I would like to read a passage. Theories of art do not make a critic. He appreciates art the better if he understands or tries to understand the nature of the creative process. He must know that the artist's instincts, his capacity for exploration or experiment, and his awareness of history, personal and contemporary, determine the quality of his vision. Every artist is great, significant, or mediocre in proportion to how he manages to relate these factors in the understanding of reality. Now, therefore, while it is very, it could be very interesting and very creative to have this relationship, there are certain dangers. I know of any number of cases where the critics and artists have fallen apart just because the critic had the courage to point out, here you fail. And therefore, nobody wants to be You know, and our age is an age which is obsessed with success. That's the bloody problem. I mean, everybody must succeed. Whereas some of the greatest movements in the history of art are moments when somebody dared to fail. And the failure was more significant than any number of success. Now, this is where the ethos matters. I'm afraid in India there is more money in the arts, but by the same token, there's less sensitivity and there's less critical climate about art.
On that note, Mr. Vajpeyi, one of the things that somewhat destroyed Richard later in his life, Richard died when he was 58, and he was at that time the secretary of the Lalit Kala Academy. The Lalit Kala Academy is the state academy, and at the time, in the 50s and the 60s and even the 70s, it was the only body that actually promoted art. It was the only form of showing art. It was the only platform that artists could use. So Richard was appointed secretary to the Lalit Kala, and it didn't end very well. And I was just wondering, first maybe if Pablo could speak a little bit about that. And then Mr. Vajpeyi, who was also the chairman, who was recently the chairman of the Lalit Kala Academy. As he says, Richard was at the Lalit Kala when it mattered, and he was at the Lalit Kala when it ceased to matter. So maybe we could just get these responses and then open it up to the audience for questions.
Well, I mean, I have little to say except that, you know, I think anybody in the arts, if they go in to work with the bureaucracy, they have to have some kind of talent to work in the bureaucracy. Mr. Vajpeyi has, I think, mastered some of that. But I think my father was pretty lost in terms of how to deal with certain elements in the bureaucracy. He was a great ideas man. He was a great thinker, was able to put things, great shows together, revitalize certain parts. So he was the artistic director. But then there was always this administrative layer, and I think that got too much. Plus, there were string pullings, politics, vested interests that always happen, this lobby, that lobby. And at the end of the day, I think that sort of became too much. And he had a stroke. And it's sort of tragic because he had a stroke at a meeting at the then chairman's house. And they just thought that, oh, well, you know, he's not very well. And they lay him down. And then many hours later in the evening, they brought him back home. Maybe if they had rushed him to a hospital, he may have been in a better state. But then that is the way that it all went. And it was sad for a man who had many talents, who probably could have done much more to have gone at that age.
Well, you know, I have done many stupid things in my life. It's a long tale of stupidities, like anybody else's perhaps, but at least mine. But one of the most stupid decisions I took was to accept the offer of the chairmanship of the Lalit Kala Academy. In the sad belief that things could be turned around. And after being there for 4 years, I realized, and I tried my best, artists who have left Lalit Kala Academy, significant. You see, our academies, the national academies, sadly have become national fora of mediocrity. And mediocrity is the more numerous, is the more vocal, is the more aggressive, is the more organized, because excellence lives in isolation, in its own lonesome grandeur. It doesn't need you know, and excellent people can't get together anyway, because each one hates everybody else's excellence. So that creates a problem. But I tried, and I think I succeeded to a certain extent in persuading the artists to come back. But I could not change the bureaucratic structure. Although I have been a bureaucrat myself for 35 years, and I was not such a bad bureaucrat as I look. You know, I mean, I was a reasonably successful bureaucrat, but there it was. Luckily, the decline of public institutions in India, particularly in the field of visual arts, does not seem to matter, because private initiatives have come in a big way, and they provide the space without bureaucratic and other kinds of political. There is a politics of art and, among the galleries and things of that kind, but that is a politics which has a free play. But unlike the politics which is in these National Academy. And yet, in a democratic setup, everything to be given over to the private sector is not a very healthy approach. After all, even in the most capitalist countries, whether it is the United States or UK or what you have, the state has to play a role, a role at arm's length, but a role of support. And that, unfortunately, in India is at the moment, this is my feeling, in some kind of a nebulous state. You do not know what's going to happen because everybody knows. I mean, look at the National Academies. I had dismissed the secretary, which I thought was one of the nicest things I did in my life, but he was reinstated after I left. I left in December 2011, and there is no chairman till date. The Sahitya Academy's chairman died, unfortunately, but they don't have a permanent secretary. The Sangeet Natak Academy does not have a regular secretary. And the Ministry of Culture is quite unconcerned, as far as I know. I mean, if there is concern, it must be a state secret, because nobody knows about it. And this is a state secret which even the state doesn't know about it. You know, they should be concerned. And I can well imagine a person like Richard Bartholomew. I mean, you know, I am a more shameless, perhaps, a more stubborn, shameless person, so I did not suffer from a stroke in the Lalit Kala Academy. But I can fully understand that what the Lalit Kala would have done to Richard Bartholomew, and that he suffered this stroke at the house of the chairman is a good metaphor of what that thing could be. But on the other hand, what you would remember about Richard is not what he did in Lalit Kala, but what he did in art. And I think that is a huge contribution. He remains one of the most essential witnesses to what was happening to Indian art in 70s and 80s. And that is more important. That is what will survive. And it will survive even the demise of Lalit Kala. And I hope it happens soon. I mean, the demise.
On that note, maybe we could have a few questions from the audience, if anybody would like to ask. We have a question up front here, right in front.
Sir, I'm curious. You spoke about the fact that converting what is sort of painted is difficult to interpret in words. So I just want to know, if you have two art critics who are both equally prolific, have covered the same number of works, how would you say one is better than the other? Because you would say both views are equally important, seen from two different perspectives. How would you say one critic is better than the other? That's what my question was.
Well, partly, it's a difficult question. But one is that whose view ultimately prevails over time. There were people who thought Picasso was a sham when he was at the pinnacle of his creativity. The people who thought that, I mean, T.S. Eliot was a joke. If you remember, Cambridge and Oxford did not allow T.S. Eliot to be taught until, I think, mid-40s or something like that. So the critics, what they do, ultimately, it's out of a dialogue, a critical debate, that things get settled. But at any given time, finally, a critical consensus emerges, in spite of whatever he is, one may have said or one may not have said. And that critical consensus is a kind of a common sense. So people come to think that T.S. Eliot is a great writer, that James Joyce, his Finnegans Wake could not be understood by anybody. But now everybody recognizes it's a classic. Of course, the other day I said classics are books about which everybody talks and nobody reads. That's another matter. But there is a critical consensus which emerges over time. But when a powerful critic, a critic who has prestige, who has reputation for objectivity, for fair-mindedness, for knowledge and depth, and for concern for creativity, and respect and love for creativity, when he says something adverse or positive, it matters. But there are all kinds of people call themselves critics who know nothing about anything. And you know, just because they are reporters or they are these bite seekers, you know, can I have a bite? And to these charming girls, I always say, can I have a bite on you as well? Yes.
Any other question?
Yeah.
There's somebody. Or
Yes.
There's one
would
here.
you please? There's a gentleman here.
Could you hear this new term called transcend art? Transcend art. A group of artists, they have developed a theory that since they are actually employing an extremely contemporary techniques for their presentation, the paintings and the sculptures and installation arts, they have developed a theory called transcend art, where they themselves are writing a very brief note about each display. For example, a painting which is very abstract, instead of being misinterpreted completely by the critics or the viewers or somebody, they give a small brief note beneath the painting and give a kind of a direction to the viewers. They are actually categorizing themselves transcend art. It's actually being kind of appreciated by some other people, because the moment you enter the gallery, most often, most of the viewers, they don't really understand when they finish the viewing of the gallery. So they are actually comforting them. Do you endorse that?
can I answer that one as somebody who writes about art?
Yeah, please do. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, I write about art on a daily basis. I write about 3 stories a day on art, which is quite intense and rigorous. The worst part of my job is really to read press releases that are sent to me by gallerists and by galleries and sometimes by artists. I think I could make a list of at least 10 words that are the most overused and mean nothing. From words like juxtaposition to metaphysical to, you name it. It doesn't make any sense whatsoever. So that's one layer of nonsense that one has to deal with. And on the other level, it is these notes that artists send you about their work. They give you a direction, they kind of nudge you in the sense of what they want you to think about their work. When you actually look at the work, it doesn't make it any better. And sometimes it's like they're talking about an entirely different piece of work because you just don't see it in what you're actually seeing. It's the most confusing thing. And I think that's also the reason why you don't have a lot of people writing about art these days, because when you look at the press releases, you really, really cannot make out head nor tail of what they're saying. So I don't know if I'd necessarily endorse it. I think there are larger sort of systemic problems in terms of just discourse around art. I don't think it's solved with an artist explaining. I don't think it's really the business of an artist to explain his work.
Okay, there's somebody here.
Can we just take another
No, we'll
question
we'll
so that because
there's somebody here.
there's somebody
Yes,
here.
please.
And then another question there.
Hi. Hello. There seems to be a state of apathy that the art institution, the state-run art institutions seem to have run themselves into. Now, there have been cases in the past where there has been, great successes also with certain directors in certain institutions like the National Museum or the NGMA. Now, so my question is that, is it that the whole bureaucracy thing in art is not working anymore with the current situation, or is it that the people who are at the helm of these institutions or who are nominated by the government or other agencies, they are not probably into it as much? So, and what is the way out? Because, some of the biggest estates or biggest collections are controlled / owned by NGMA or the Indira Gandhi National Center for the Arts. So for us to just turn a blind eye to that is something which is not a healthy option. So what is the way out of that? Is it like, limit the bureaucracy in it, or I don't know, I'm just...
Well, you see, ultimately, whatever may be the nature of bureaucracy, howsoever sensitive, professional, the people at the helm of affairs matter. So if you have a person who has a vision, who understands the situation of the arts, and who's likely to, you see, the point is, are you able to promote something which is significant, but you don't like it? I'll give you an example. Mr. J. Swaminathan, a great painter, was with us in Bharat Bhavan. He was deadly opposed to the neo-narrative art. He wrote against it, he spoke at every forum against it. But the largest single public collection of neo-narrative art of the 80s is in Bharat Bhavan, created by him. Because he said, I'm in a public institution. I have my viewpoint, and I will always stand by it. But as a public functionary, even though I do not approve of it, it is a significant presence on the scene. Therefore, we must have it. Now, if you have a person of that kind, then things change. The second point is that professionalization, what we have in Lalit Kala Academy, let me give you an example. Somebody who joined as a lower division clerk now is the deputy secretary programs. Poor chap has no notion. I mean, they could have worked in the excise department. They could have worked in the forest department. They would have been clerks anywhere, as good as bad. But they are there. So you have to think of restructuring, autonomy of the institution. The government does not interfere. But these institutions have developed their own bureaucracies. And those bureaucracies enjoy all the privileges that the civil servants enjoy, the government servants enjoy, and they have no accountability. So it's a bit of all kinds of issues get intermixed. But yes, I can publicly say this, there is a person called Diwan Manna in Chandigarh Lalit Kala Academy who has done remarkable work as chairman. And there was somebody in Kerala Lalit Kala Academy, the only two state academies who have done remarkably well because there have been people there heading them and who could turn around. But most state academies have collapsed. Yes. Yes, please.
Vajpeyi, you have been a creative person, you have been a bureaucrat. And my question is, a lot of government money goes, a lot of taxpayers' money goes into these academies. So what is, you said you sacked a few secretaries who worked under you because you didn't find the role. So what is the suggestion to the government of India, where crores and lakhs and crores and rupees are spent in the name of academies, how it should become productive? How can you as the government, can you build something kind of a Jaipur literacy festival? Can you have an international art show of India? I want my question, how should the academies should be run?
But that's a large question and I think we are running on time. But let me put it, I do not believe that this cannot be done. And I also do not believe that the public institutions must withdraw. No. I think the public institutions must be rehabilitated, re-strengthened, restructured. And it can be done if you have the necessary political will. Resources are not wanting. Vision is lacking. If you have a vision, because what Lalit Kala Academy could do in Richard Bartholomew's time, it cannot do the same thing now, because the art scene has changed in significant, substantial ways.
All right, we're running out of time, so we'll leave you on that slightly depressing note. Copies of the book are available in the bookstore. It's a bit expensive, but that's because a lot of hard work and labor and many, many years have gone into its making. But it's available there, and then Pablo's available here. One of the most beautiful things about this book, apart from the writing, are the photographs. There are some beautiful photographs that have never been shown before of artists and hanging out, partying, flirting, etc. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Pablo and Ashok. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ashok. Thank you, Pablo.